Hi, folks, and welcome to this discussion about China's economy. I'm Scott Kennedy, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS. I think most folks know that one of my big ways in which I try and learn about China is getting jet lag. I travel to China quite a bit. In 2025, this year, I've made 4 trips to China. Often I go to Beijing and Shanghai, but I also get around to other cities as well to visit companies, talk to their CEOs, their engineers, lawyers, look at the technology, try it out, and get a kind of tangible sense of where China's economy is going. And, you know, when you go to China, things seem difficult to understand, ambiguous, cloudy, but if you go more than once and you look around, things start to look a little bit clearer and you get some sense of what's going on. And then, of course, if you go multiple times, then hopefully you eventually get a much clearer picture of what's happening. And trying to understand the Chinese economy requires one to pay constant attention because things seem to be always evolving, and the more times that you look at China, the better you are at having sort of an overall view of things. Now, in 2017, 8 years ago, I wrote a report for CSIS called The Fat Tech Dragon. And the basic conclusion of this report, after having made a lot of trips around China, visiting companies, looking at quantitative data, is that China was making a lot of technological progress, but they were wasting an enormous amount of resources. They were not metabolizing much of that investment very well, hence the name, the Fat Tech Dragon. Well, I've continued to pay attention to what's going on in China technologically, and I have tried to update things. And recently, I've been collaborating with Scott Rosell, who's in the photograph here. He's a professor at Stanford University. I focus mostly on urban China and tech. Scott and his team focus heavily on rural China. He spends a lot of time trying to analyze human capital in China. That's where a lot of his emphasis is, and he does a lot of quantitative work in villages across the country. And he and I published a piece this October in Foreign Policy in which we tried to explain the relationship between China's tech progress and why it also is an economy that seems to be growing extremely slowly. And out of that, we came up with the idea that China is no longer a fat tech dragon. We call it a slow tech dragon. And I wanted to describe a little bit about why we reach that conclusion, and then see if the most recent trip I took to China leads us in any different kind of direction, and where the mood is in China on the economy. So let's talk about the tech side first, and really don't need to go into this in much detail, but I think anybody looking at China's economy realizes that there's been a lot of tech progress, and the quantitative data is certainly there. If you look at total research and development spending over the last few decades, you see that China's increased quite a bit. Maybe some of this spending originally was in real estate and really not R&D, but I think most folks would agree that gradually it's become much, much more realistic. Chinese government R&D spending is more than the U.S., but the U.S. has a lot more corporate R&D spending. This is through 2023. If you look up through 2024 and probably for 2025, China, those numbers will be basically identical, or even China might have slightly higher levels of R&D spending. That has translated into China moving up the ranks of innovative countries. The Global Innovation Index, which the World Intellectual Property Organization creates along with business schools at Cornell and in France. This is the gold standard for measuring innovation capacity and capabilities, and China now finds itself up amongst all of the most advanced economies, separating itself from developing countries. One measure of that are patents. Of course, China files the most patents of anyone in the world, and if you just use Chinese data, you might be skeptical. But if you look at the patent cooperation treaty applications, which have a higher standard, China's still filing a lot of high quality patents, more invention patents now than in the past as a share of total patents. That's also translated into innovation and success in a whole variety of industries. We've spent a lot of time looking in the trustee chair at the vehicle sector and electric vehicles, and you can see China went from exporting basically no cars to being now the world's largest exporter of vehicles. And I think anyone who travels in China will come across EVs wherever you go. This is Xiaomi's SU Ultra. They came out with the SU7 in 2024, and in 2025 they came out with the SU7 Ultra. It looks super fancy. A lot of folks think it looks a little bit too much like a Porsche Carrera, but when you get inside these cars, when you talk to engineers, when you learn about them, these are not just superficial shells of good vehicles. Auto sector analysts rank them quite highly. I went to BYD this past summer and visited the headquarters, took a tour, test drove several vehicles, including the one that's on the screen behind me. Beside the fact that it drove as well as just about any SUV that I've been in, it had the oddity of having a drone on the roof, a DJI drone, a company that is on the entity list. And that drone took off while I was driving. It video recorded while I was driving, then landed back on the roof while I was still driving. That's a superficial description of technological advancement. I'm not really sure why you need a drone on the roof for your vehicle, but nevertheless, it was something to note. And in any case, that's just one sector where you see a lot of progress. Of course, China's economy, though, is growing slowly. And that is not entirely divorced from all of this effort in tech. Actually, Professor Rosell and I think that these things are connected to each other. So first, the data on growth is, everyone agrees on it. This is Chinese official statistics, which show over the last 15 years, China's economy growing quite slowly. If you use unofficial metrics, the numbers probably look worse, but everyone's numbers point in the downward trend. In 2025, the word of the year in China has been involution. It is the consequence of way too much production and output, even in sectors where China is developing very good products and very good technologies. One example of this is a company that I visited recently called Asphalt, or Fengchao, which is in Changzhou, Jiangsu province. I believe they rank about 5th in terms of production and market share for batteries. And I took a look at their manufacturing facilities, 95% automated. They really seem to know what they are doing, but they are 5th in China. They have 9 factories in China, 1 in Thailand, and the market is saturated with batteries. It's not to criticize asphalt per se, but what it is to say is that you got a lot of battery capacity in China that is not being used, or you have built up inventories. After the trip to the company, went to a shopping mall where you can see in the mall, just like in every mall in China, you see cars in the middle being displayed. Went for coffee and then looked across the street from the shopping mall, and I was told by the people I was with that all of the apartment buildings that were across the street, these high rises, were all empty. Times 300 Chinese cities, that tells you China's biggest overcapacity problem is in residential real estate, which is the biggest drag on growth. China also has some technologies where they've put in an enormous amount of resources and still not successful. I wrote about this in Fat Tech Dragon in 2017 with regard to the C919, China's alternative to Boeing's 737 and Airbus's A320. And the story is still basically the same. Yes, this plane now exists, as it did not in 2017. It was still very early development then. But the delivery schedule of the C919 still can't match anything that Boeing and Airbus are doing. Here's deliveries up through 2024, by which time Comac, the company in China that makes these planes, had delivered 16 of these birds to customers almost entirely in China. That is a lot of resources being invested in a very high-profile industry, which my expectation is that China is going to continue to be behind in commercial aircraft, and the chances of it catching up anytime soon are extremely small. If you look at return on assets, Chinese companies, whether they are state-owned or private, their profits have been going down. And in fact, the profits of private companies have been falling even faster than state-owned companies. And that's probably because private companies started with a much higher profit level. And if everyone's lost 10% profits of their profits, that's a bigger loss in absolute terms for private companies. So China's economy, from the perspective of the producers, is not doing well. And that is also translating into higher debt loads. This is Chinese total social finance as a share of GDP. Again, a number that has continually been heading up and reflects problems in the economy that are not being resolved. From the perspective of consumers, the things also look difficult. This is China's Consumer Confidence Index over the last several years, and what you can see is that from 2022, in fact, March and April of 2022, when China had the lockdown in Shanghai and then it expanded elsewhere, consumer confidence dropped dramatically in China. And it's been like the Chinese consumer has had a heart attack and flatlined. The number has not increased at all since some momentary blips of improvement, but still nowhere near where it was pre-lockdown. And this is something that you notice when you go to shopping malls, when you talk to consumers. They are not spending where they were before. And so the share of the economy that is created by consumption has dropped significantly from where it was. You still see conspicuous consumption. That's not to say that there aren't consumers and not consumption in China, but nowhere near the level of growth that it had in the past. When you talk to Chinese households, you also get another sense of anxiety. And Professor Rosell at Stanford, along with colleagues of his at Harvard, Marty White and others, they did a survey of attitudes about people's views of inequality in China. They've done this survey multiple times over the past few decades. And what they found is that in previous iterations of this survey, when you ask people who were poor why you are poor, they gave certain kinds of answers. And if you ask them why they're wealthy, those who are wealthy, they also have interesting answers. But in the most recent iteration of this survey, answers changed. So in previous iterations of the survey, when they asked folks, why are you wealthy, they primarily said it's because they work hard and because they are smart. When you ask them now, why are you wealthy, they say because they know how to work the system. They have connections. You get the opposite answers from folks who are poor, who now, instead of blaming themselves, blame the system for their circumstances. And that's a significant shift, and it aligns with the transition we've seen about people's anxieties on the consumption side of things. The other area that Professor Rosell highlights is the challenges in human capital in China. Obviously, in urban China, in coastal cities, you have extremely highly educated people who are in universities, graduate degrees, very capable in science and technology, and they have been the folks who have been innovating and creating in all of these companies. But you also have hundreds of millions of people in China, primarily in rural China, but also in the cities, who have not got a high school education. And China's human capital challenge is really dramatic, both at the top end where there are not enough jobs for folks coming out of university, but also at the lower end where people are not really prepared to plug into a high-tech 21st century economy. That kind of wide distribution of human capital has always been a problem for countries all around the world. Countries with this kind of human capital distribution have a very difficult time, to say the least, from escaping the middle income trap. And that is a genuine, real challenge for China. Now, just before I went to China in November, in late October, China issued its 15th five-year plan recommendations. That's not the full plan. The full plan comes out next spring. But each time they issue a five-year plan, they come out with the recommendations first, which they came out this time in late October after their fourth plenum of the Communist Party Central Committee meeting. Of course, Xi Jinping front and center in all of those events. And most of the folks reading the recommendations came away with the conclusion that China's economic strategy going forward is going to look a lot like it has over the last decade. The recommendations do identify that China has serious economic problems, that there's insufficient domestic demand, that the economy is imbalanced, that there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed. And that is different from 2022, 2023, most of 2024, when China's leadership basically said everything was fine. So since late 2024, they've begun to admit that there are significant problems, including involution. It is the word of the year in China because the party has sanctioned that as the framework for having debate about how to address China's problems. That said, if you read these recommendations, it does say, yes, you need to expand domestic demand and address the issues that are limiting demand. But it focuses not just on addressing, people's concerns about the value of their housing or the social safety net or education, but it puts a lot of emphasis on the supply of high-quality products, which sounds like the typical way the party addresses its economy, which is through stepping on the accelerator to get more investment as opposed to addressing the underlying anxieties of households and consumers. That seems to be the emphasis in that recommendations. So I went to China a week after this came out, and I heard a lot of conversation about Chinese economic policy and where things are going. In part is because I attended the Caixin summit. Caixin is China's most reformist business media organization. They've been around for 16 years. This was the 16th summit. The founder of Caixin, Hu Shuli, had previously created another media organization, Caixin, which had been around for 10 years prior. And this is really a very good event to come to take the pulse of how economic reformists think about where China's economy is going. And if I get the opportunity, I try to attend. Of course, they had high-tech gadgets there. This is one of the robots which was walking around the hotel lobby while the conference was going on. Of course, if you go outside, you see, of course, EVs. If you go to factories, you could see a lot of tech. That part of China had not changed there. Now, I got a chance to speak about U.S.-China relations, and in a future BRAC discussion, I'll tell you more about what I heard there, but I want to talk more about what I saw with the economy. And particularly I want to highlight that at this year's Caixin Summit, the level of attendees and the critique they had of economic policy was higher level participation and somewhat more direct critique of economic policy. And things began at the very beginning with a video recording of one of China's most famous economists, Wu Jinglian. He was not at the conference. He's 95 years old, not in great health, but they went to where he lives and recorded a message that he gave, which they played for everybody in the audience. And he talked about the ninth five-year plan from a few decades ago. I had to go back and reread about the ninth five-year plan, but he was very informative. And what he emphasized a very simple point. He said in the ninth five-year plan, this is in the early 1990s, the plan discussed what they call the liange zhuangbian, the two transitions. And the first transition that China's economy needed to make was from extensive growth to intensive growth. So just throwing more inputs versus getting higher productivity out of the economy. That was the first one that they mentioned in the early 90s. The second transition that they mentioned from back then was going from a situation where the government was directly intervening in the economy to where it was just providing macro management, otherwise from plan to market. And Professor Wu said at the end of his talk, we are still trying to grapple with these two kinds of challenges. Hint, hint, the issues that we faced 30 years ago, the country has not resolved, and it's not being resolved by the 15th five-year plan recommendations. That is the way economists try to raise questions about economic policy, is by going into the past. In addition to him, former Finance Minister Lou Jiwei spoke at the conference, and he used his remarks to talk entirely about China's real estate sector and housing, and said that significant reforms were needed to clean up this mess, and that China needed to change a whole variety of policies, including addressing residency policies that limit the ability of those who live in the countryside but who move to cities from buying housing in certain cities. That kind of restriction has been lifted in many cities, but not in all of them. In any case, the fact that he focused all of his discussion about housing and real estate, a lot of people were surprised that he was willing to speak directly to what is a problem that is still nowhere being close to being resolved. In addition to their voices, Caixin also invited to speak two economists who just won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. And they do this every year. But this year, they invited Joel Makier, who's from Northwestern University, and Philippe Aghion, who's a French economist. Both of them and a third economist won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences this year because of their work on technology and innovation. Different arguments that they make. Makier focuses on culture and Western cultures and how that helped the West have an industrial revolution and technological advancement before, well ahead of China. Aghion talks about how Schumpeterian competition is important to get innovation. So if you have a very vibrant, competitive high-tech sector with a lot of small, medium-sized companies, usually that's the best way to get a lot of innovation. Hint, hint, what Caixin was doing is using these Nobel Prize-winning economists to imply that Chinese economic policy needs to be changed to address the kind of things that they were suggesting. I also went to a closed-door panel that Caixin had on the topic of involution. The former central bank governor Zhou Xiaochuan, a noted reformer during the last 25 years, was there and spoke. It was closed door, so I can't say what any of the individuals, including central bank governor Zhou, said, but nevertheless, I can tell you that it was a wide-ranging critique of the problem of involution, different explanations for why it had occurred, different suggestions for what should be done to address it, but overall worries that this was an endemic problem that China was not putting enough effort to tackle. Now, after I left China at the end of November, we've had a couple weeks, and just this week they've held, the leadership held their annual Central Economic Work Conference, and of course Xi Jinping chairs that, and Xinhua, China's state news agency, published his remarks and outlined what the basic conclusions were for the Central Economic Work Conference that lay out their plans for 2026. And essentially it is a copy and paste of the conclusions and plans that were drawn out in the 15th Five-Year Plan recommendations from late October. Again, identifying serious challenges that the economy faces, but putting most of the emphasis on the need to continue to develop what they call new quality productive forces, i.e. high tech. At the same time, there is recognition that China's economy has structural challenges, that there's insufficient domestic demand. But again, as previously they outlined in the recommendations and in other places, a focus on not just addressing people's difficulties with the social safety net or education. It does say you need to put more resources there, but still overall emphasis on the supply side, the production side, the investment side. That is the side of the economy the party feels most capable of managing, and where you're going to see most of the priority going if the Central Economic Work Conference conclusions and the 15th Five-Year Plan recommendations are implemented as they've been described. My sense is that's going to leave a lot of the folks in China's business world, a lot of their economists, unsatisfied. Of course, it's also going to leave a lot of other countries, trading partners in the West, in particular the United States and Europe, who have economic difficulties with China and say, you know, what we really need is China to rebalance its domestic economy, to reduce its trade surplus, to increase consumption, and it doesn't look like Chinese economic policy is going to address those challenges based on what they've described. So 2026, we're going to see most likely a summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump, and they actually might meet 4 times next year. And I bet the economic challenges that they have with each other will be a significant part of the conversation, as it will between China and many others. There's an increasing conversation about whether China should appreciate the renminbi, in addition to all those other challenges that we've talked about. But China's economic success at home is creating winners and losers, but it's also creating challenges in its relationship with the rest of the world. So I came away from this trip thinking that, yes, China is still a slow tech dragon, as Professor Rosell and I wrote in October, and it's looking like it's not going to deviate significantly from that course. As a result, I think some of the tensions that China has domestically between producers and a lot of its consumers are going to continue to intensify in 2026. And the challenges that it faces with trading partners around the world are also likely to intensify. Even though we have this momentary ceasefire in U.S.-China relations, that isn't addressing the underlying anxieties and tensions and worries that others have about China's economy. So I expect 2026 to be a moment when these conversations may get even more intense than they have in 2025. Thanks a lot.